There are moments in life when silence becomes the loudest sound in the room. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of rest, but the silence that falls like a curtain of iron between the world of the living and the world of the unknown. The silence that settles inside a hospital corridor at 2 in the morning, when the fluorescent lights hum with an eerie, indifferent glow, and the only sound a mother can hear is the mechanical breathing of a machine that is keeping her child alive, because his own lungs have forgotten how. That was the silence that lived inside room 7 of the intensive care unit at St. Bernard's Medical Center on a Tuesday night in November. And inside that silence, a boy named Elijah was dying. He was 16 years old. He had brown eyes that used to laugh before his eyelids could even catch up. He had a gap between his 2 front teeth that his grandmother called the door where blessings walk through. He had a habit of humming old gospel songs when he was nervous, something he had picked up from his mother without even realizing it, the way children absorb the sacred things of their parents, like sunlight through skin. He loved basketball, he loved comic books, and he loved the smell of his mother's kitchen. On Sunday mornings, when she fried plantains, and the whole apartment filled up with a warmth that made even the coldest winters feel survivable. But none of that. Not one single beautiful thing about Elijah was visible now. What was visible was a body so still, it seemed to belong to stone. A chest that rose and fell only because a ventilator commanded it to. Skin that had gone from deep mahogany to an ashen pale grey that his mother Miriam could not look at without her. Hands beginning to tremble, tubes everywhere, wires everywhere, monitors casting a greenish glow across his face, like something out of a nightmare. She could not wake from because she was already awake. She had been awake for 4 days. 4 days since Elijah collapsed on the basketball court. At Jefferson High, mid-jump, mid-flight, mid-life, and simply fell like a star pulled suddenly from its orbit. Like a candle snuffed by an invisible hand, the diagnosis came in pieces, each one heavier than the last, delivered by doctors in careful voices, trained to carry terrible news: acute myocarditis. They said severe inflammation of the heart muscle, triggered by a viral infection that had gone undetected, masked behind what everyone assumed. There was just a lingering cold. His heart, they explained gently, so gently, as if the gentleness could soften the devastation out. In his heart had been quietly fighting a war for weeks, and none of them had known. And now the damage was catastrophic. His cardiac function had dropped to less than 15%. His organs were beginning to show signs of failure, and he had been placed on maximum ventilatory support. They had done everything within the reach of science and medicine and human skill. And still, Elijah was slipping away. Dr. Nathaniel Osei, the attending cardiologist, a man with 30 years of experience, a man who had seen more heartbreak than most human beings could survive, sat across from Miriam in a small consultation room on the 3rd day and looked at her with eyes that told the truth before his mouth even opened. He was a man of science. He believed in data and evidence and measurable outcomes. And every piece of data available to him pointed in one direction, and one direction only, Mrs. Carter, he said, his voice low and steady and unbearably kind. We have exhausted every intervention currently available to us. His heart is not responding. I want to be honest with you because you deserve honesty. The likelihood of recovery at this stage is... He paused. The pause lasted a century very small. Miriam did not cry in that room, and she had no tears left. She had spent them all. She was hollow. She was a woman made of grief and exhaustion, and a love so fierce it had nowhere left to go. Because the person she loved most in the world was lying in a bed 20 feet away and leaving her slowly breath by mechanical breath, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. And she walked back to room 7. She sat down in the chair beside his bed, the chair she had not left except to use the bathroom. She took his hand in both of hers, careful around the IV line, and she pressed it to her cheek. His skin was cool, not cold, but cool, in a way that frightened her more than cold would have, because cold was final, and cool was almost I was the most unbearable place in the universe. Elijah, she whispered, baby. I'm here. Mama's right here. The monitors beeped, the ventilator hissed. The fluorescent light hummed. He did not stir outside the ICU. The waiting room had become a kind of small, exhausted village. Miriam's sister Dorothea had flown in from Atlanta on the first day and had not left. Pastor Williams from their church had come and prayed and come again. Neighbors brought food that no one could eat. Friends sent messages that no one had the strength to answer. And sitting in the corner of that waiting room, curled up on a plastic chair, with her knees pulled to her chest,
watch over her.
I was a little girl. Her name was Grace. She was 8 years old. She was Elijah's neighbor, had grown up 2 doors down from him, in the same apartment building on Maple Street, had spent her whole life watching him from the slightly adoring distance. That little sisters who weren't really sisters maintained. She called him E, he called her Little G. He had taught her how to ride a bike in the parking lot 2 summers ago, running alongside her. In his hand on the back of the seat, his voice steady and encouraging. You've got it, Little G. You've got it. Don't look down. Look where you want to go. She had not slept in 2 days. Her mother, who worked nights at the hospital as a nursing aide, had brought her along because there was no one else to watch her. And Grace had refused to leave anyway. She understood, in the way that children sometimes understand things, more completely than adults. Give them credit for that. Something enormous was happening, that the world was in danger of becoming a different kind of world. A world without Elijah's laugh, without his gap-toothed smile, without the sound of his basketball bouncing against the hallway floor. On Saturday mornings, she could not allow that. She didn't have money, she didn't have medicine, and she didn't have the education or the skill or the authority to walk into that room and fix anything. But she had something on the 4th night, the night that the doctor said would likely be the last night. Grace slipped away from the waiting room. While her mother was talking to Dorothea, she walked down the corridor past the nurse's station, where a kind night nurse named Sandra looked up at me, saw the small, determined figure in the pink sweater, and later she would say she still couldn't explain why, simply let her pass. Grace pushed open the door of room 7 with both hands because it was heavy and she was small, and she pushed it anyway. Miriam looked up. Her face was a landscape of exhaustion and grief. But when she saw Grace, when she saw this tiny girl with her braids coming slightly undone, and her eyes wide and serious and full of a love that had no complicated conditions attached to it, something cracked open in Miriam's chest. Not broke, cracked open. It's like a seed beginning to split along its seam. Little G, Miriam whispered. Grace walked to the other side of the bed. She stood on her tiptoes to look at Elijah. Really look at him, taking in the tubes and the wires and the machine, breathing for him, not flinching, not looking away. Then she looked at Miriam. Can I pray for him? She asked. Her voice was so small, so earnest, so completely without the self-consciousness that adults bring to sacred things. Miriam could not speak. She nodded. Grace reached out and took Elijah's other hand. Her small brown fingers wrapped around his long ones, and she bowed her head, and she closed her eyes, and she began to pray. And this is the part that everyone who was present that night would spend the rest of their lives trying to find words for. It was not a polished prayer. It was not the kind of prayer recited from memory, built from formal language and theological precision. It was the prayer of a child, raw and unfiltered and real, the way children's prayers always are. Because children have not yet learned to perform sincerity, they simply are sincere. She prayed the way she breathed naturally, completely God. She said, and her voice, though small, seemed to fill the room. It seemed to push against the walls, seemed to sit down in the space between the beeping and the humming and the hissing and occupy it entirely. God, it's me, Grace. You know me. I live on Maple Street. I'm the one who broke my arm. I fallen out of the tree in the backyard when I was 6. And you took care of me then. And I know you're big and I know you're busy. But I need you to hear me right now, please. Because my friend E is really sick. And I don't know how to help him. I don't know medicine or any of that stuff. But you do. You made him. You made his heart. And I know you can fix it. Because you made it in the first place. And if you made something, you know how to fix it. She paused. In the pause, Miriam realized she was holding her breath. He's my friend, Grace continued. And her voice broke on the last word just slightly. Just enough for a tear to find its way down her cheek. He taught me how to ride my bike. And he always checks on me when he sees me in the hall. He's a good person, God. He's really good. And I know you love good people. I know you do. So please don't take him yet. And his mama needs him. And I need him. And I think the world needs him too. Because there aren't enough people in it like E. The tear dropped from her chin onto the back of Elijah's hand. One small warm drop of water. One entirely weightless, priceless, immeasurable act. Miriam watched it fall, and something she could not name, something that lived below the reach of language, moved through her like a current, like a tide, like the first warm wind of spring. After the longest winter of her life, she bowed her own head, and for the first time in 4 days, she prayed too, not with words, with everything she had left, which wasn't much. But she gave it all. The monitors beeped steadily. The ventilator hissed, the fluorescent light hummed, and then something changed. No one could say exactly when it began. That was the thing that would confound every physician, every specialist, every researcher, who would later pore over the charts and the data. And the time-stamped readings from that night, there was no singular, dramatic moment. They could point to no crash cart, no defibrillator sending a shock through the room, no emergency surgery, no experimental drug, administered at the last possible second. There was nothing in the medical record that could account for what happened next. Nothing that could be measured, documented, replicated, or explained within the tidy boundaries of what science had decided was possible. There was only a small girl's prayer. And then there was a miracle. It began as a warmth. That was how Miriam would describe it later. In the weeks and months and years that followed, when people asked her, and they always asked her, because the story spread the way. True stories always do, quietly at first, and then everywhere at once. She would say it began as a warmth, not in the room, not in the air, but inside her chest, in that hollow place, where her grief had taken up permanent residence. In the exact center of her exhaustion, a warmth like the first sip of something hot on a winter morning. Like sunlight, finding a gap in heavy curtains, small at first, almost imperceptible, and then growing. She didn't open her eyes right away. She kept them closed. She kept her head bowed. She kept her hands wrapped around her son's cool fingers, and she let that warmth move through her like water, finding its level, filling every cracked and empty place inside her. She did not know what it was. She would not have been able to explain it, but she knew, with the kind of knowing that exists beneath thought, beneath logic, beneath everything that can be argued or doubted. She knew that something had shifted, something had entered the room. Grace felt it too. She lifted her head slowly, her eyes still wet, and looked at Elijah's face. Later she would say, in the simple and devastating honesty of a child, that she saw a color change. He got warmer looking. She would tell her mother, like when the sun comes up and the sky gets that orange color. Before it goes blue, he looked like that, her mother. I would not know what to do with this information. Neither would anyone else. So they would simply hold it the way you hold something. too precious and too fragile to put down, but too large to fully understand. At 2:47 inches the morning, Sandra, the night nurse, came in to perform her regular check of Elijah's vitals. It was routine. She had done it every hour, the readings each time, confirming what the doctors had already concluded. Her body in steady, irreversible decline, she expected nothing different. She was already composing in her mind to the gentle words she would use when she returned to the nurse's station to update the chart, the clinical language. That would mark another hour of deterioration. She looked at the monitor, she looked again, her hand, put. Moving toward the chart, stopped in midair. The cardiac output reading, which had been sitting at 14% for the past 18 hours, unmoved by any intervention, a number that represented the outer edge of survival, and then beyond it had changed. It read 19%. Sandra blinked, she checked the lead placements, she checked the monitor calibration, she looked at the number again, 19%. She checked Elijah's pulse, manually pressing 2 fingers to the inside of his wrist, and what she felt made her breath catch in her throat, in a way that had nothing to do with clinical training, and everything to do with being human. His pulse, which had been thready and faint and irregular for days, was not strong, not yet. Not by any definition of the word that could be called normal. But it was steadier, it had a rhythm, it was speaking in a language. She recognized that. She picked up the phone. She called Dr. Ose. He arrived at the ICU 17 minutes later, his coat thrown over his pajamas, his reading glasses still pushed up on his forehead. He had been asleep when the call came. The first real sleep he had allowed himself in 2 days, and he had come immediately, not because he expected a different outcome, but because 30 years in medicine had taught him that you showed up. Regardless, you showed up for the family, you showed up because it was the only decent thing to do. He looked at the monitor, he sat down on the stool beside the bed, and for a long moment, he did not speak. 19% had become 22. He began running through every possible clinical explanation. He was thorough and systematic and deeply, rigorously rational. It was who he was. It was how he had been trained. It was the foundation upon which he had built 3 decades of careful evidence-based practice. He thought about spontaneous fluctuations. He thought about monitoring artifacts. He thought about delayed drug responses. He thought about every variable, every outlier, every exception in the medical literature. He had spent his entire adult life studying, and one by one, every explanation dissolved, because by the time the sun began to rise over Street, Bernard's Medical Center is slow amber November sunrise that pressed itself against the ICU windows, like something trying to come inside. Elijah's cardiac output had climbed to 31%. His blood pressure, which had required maximum vasopressor support to maintain at dangerously low levels, had stabilized. His oxygen saturation, which had been wavering at the edge of incompatibility with life, had climbed to 94% on reduced ventilator settings, and at 6:23 inches the morning, with Miriam's hands still wrapped around his, and Grace curled up asleep in the chair in the corner, her work apparently done, and her small body finally surrendering to its exhaustion, Elijah's eyes moved beneath their lids. Miriam felt it before she saw it, as a different quality to his stillness, a tension entering his body that hadn't been there before, not the terrible rigidity of crisis, but something else, something that felt from the outside, the way waking feels from the inside, that long ascent from the depths back toward the surface, back toward light and sound, and the consciousness of being alive. His fingers, which had been limp inside her hands for 4 days, curled just slightly, just barely, just enough. Elijah Miriam breathed his name, like it was a prayer of its own, because it was every syllable of your child's name is a prayer, even when you don't know it. Elijah, baby, I'm here. Mama's right here. You follow my voice, baby, till you follow it home. His eyelids fluttered. Opened, closed again. Opened his brown eyes. The eyes that used to laugh before his face could catch up. The eyes she had been afraid she would never see open again. Found her face. They were unfocused at first, blurred by sedation, and the long journey back from wherever he had been. But they found her. They held her. And in them, she saw she knew. She saw no one could tell her otherwise. She saw the light come back, like a lamp after a power cut, like a star reappearing after clouds. The monitors erupted, not in alarming response. In the rapid cascading language of machines registering something they had not been designed to account for. Sandra came running. Dr. Ose, who had never left the room, was already on his feet, already reaching for Elijah's chart with hands that were, for perhaps the first time in 30 years of medicine, not entirely steady. Grace woke up to the commotion. She slid off the chair and padded over to the bed in her socks and looked at Elijah's open eyes. And then she looked at Miriam and she smiled. It was the simplest smile in the world, in the smile of someone who had asked for something and received it, and who found this neither surprising nor strange because she had simply known that it would be so. "Hey, E," she said softly. Elijah couldn't speak. The ventilator tube prevented it, but his eyes moved to her face, and something in them shifted the way light shifts when it recognizes something beloved. His lips around the tube tried to form a shape. Later, when the tube was removed, or 48 hours later, when his breathing had returned, and his heart had climbed to a function level that caused Dr. Ose to close his office door and sit alone for 20 minutes, with his face in his hands, not from sorrow, but from something he had no medical term for.
Wow.
Later, when Elijah could finally speak, the first complete sentence he formed, in a voice rough from disuse and thick with the residue of wherever he had been, was this: "I heard her praying." The room went still. Miriam, who was sitting beside him, who had not left, who would not leave for another 3 days, he looked at her. "Son, what did you say?" Elijah's voice was barely above a whisper, but it was his voice. It was unambiguously, miraculously, breathtakingly. His little G. "I heard her praying." I don't know how to explain it. I was somewhere far away. It was dark and quiet, and I wasn't afraid exactly, but I was far. And then I heard her voice calling me back. He paused, swallowed. She said the word needed me. Nobody ever told me that before, Grace. Sitting cross-legged on the foot of the hospital bed, in a manner that Sandra the nurse had decided after everything was simply not worth objecting to looked up from the picture book she was reading. "Well, it's true," she said simply with the magnificent, unassailable confidence of an 8-year-old who knows what she knows. And Elijah with his gap-toothed smile. Elijah with his brown eyes back and his heart beating and his chest rising and falling on its own power, by its own will, by some force that Dr. Nathaniel Ose would describe in a published case study 14 months later as a spontaneous and complete recovery, for which we have found no satisfactory clinical explanation. Elijah laughed. It was not a big laugh. His body was not yet strong enough for big laughs. It was small and rough, and a little broken around the edges, like something fragile being very carefully retrieved from the place where it had been stored. But it was real. It filled room 7, the way sunlight fills a room. When someone finally opens the curtains after a long winter, it bounced off the walls and the monitors and the ivy stands and landed on Miriam's face and broke her open, completely broke her open, in the best way, the irreversible way, the way that things which have cracked along their seams finally give way entirely and release everything inside. She wept, not the weeping of grief, not the hollow silent 4 days of nothing weeping she had done in that chair beside his bed. While the machines breathed for him, this was different. This weeping had sound. It had warmth. It came from a place so deep inside her that it had no name. The place where a mother keeps the part of herself that belongs entirely to her child, the part that goes wherever they go, and the part that's nearly left with him and was now somehow inexplicably returned. She pressed her forehead to his hand, and she wept, and she laughed, and she wept again. And Grace put down her picture book and climbed over and put both small arms around Miriam's neck and held on, and the three of them stayed like that for a long time, tangled up in each other's relief, in the specific and sacred joy that belongs only to people who have stood at the very edge of losing something and have been, against all probability and all expectation, giving it back. Dr. Osei stood in the doorway and watched. He would later say to colleagues, to journalists, to medical students who asked him about the case, that what he witnessed in that room over the following weeks was the most complete and inexplicable recovery he had encountered in 3 decades of cardiology. Elijah's heart function continued to improve at a rate that had no medical precedent. Within 6 weeks, his cardiac output had reached 68%, the lower range of normal. Within 4 months, it was 82% by the spring. He was cleared for light physical activity. By the summer, he was back on the basketball court. The medical community was baffled. The case was documented, reviewed, and ultimately classified under a category that appears in the literature with far more frequency than science is entirely comfortable admitting: unexplained recovery, spontaneous remission cases where the data tells a story and the story has no ending that science has yet managed to write. But Miriam knew the ending. Grace knew the ending. And deep in the place where memory and miracle meet, where the language of data yields to the language of the unexplainable, Elijah knew it too. On the morning, he was Bernard's Medical Center, a cold, bright December morning. The sky, the particular shade of blue that appears only in winter, sharp and clear and almost unbearably beautiful. Elijah walked out through the hospital doors under his own power, his mother on one side and Grace on the other, and her small hand taut firmly in his S. He stopped on the steps. He tilted his face up toward the winter sun. He breathed in a slow, full, enormous breath. The kind of breath you take when you understand with every cell of your body what a gift it is to take it. Too, the air was cold and it filled his lungs, and his heart beat beneath his ribs. His own heart, his repaired heart, his miraculous and inexplicable and beloved heart. And he felt it the way you only feel your heart beat when you have come close enough to losing it. To understand what it means you good, Grace asked, looking up at him. He looked down at her. The gap-toothed smile spread across his face, like sunrise. "Yeah, little G," he said, "I'm really good." And so, dear listener here, we arrive at the place where the grill must lay down the story and lift up its truth, because every story, if it is a real story, has something underneath it that is larger than the events themselves, something that remains after the details fade. And the truth underneath this story is not complicated. It does not require a degree or a doctrine or any particular set of beliefs. It is simply this: the smallest acts of love are never small. A child's prayer offered without sophistication or strategy, offered purely and simply and from the most unguarded chamber of an 8-year-old heart. And so please moved something that 4 days of the most advanced medical science available could not. Not because science is wrong, it is not wrong. Not because medicine failed, it did not fail, but because there are forces in this universe that operate in the spaces between what we can measure, and those forces respond to something ancient and simple and indestructible. They respond to love that asks for nothing in return. They respond to faith that does not wait for proof. They respond to a little girl in a pink sweater who walks into a room she was not supposed to enter, takes the hand of her friend who is leaving, and refuses with all the extraordinary, unreasonable, world-altering power of a child who has not yet been told that some things are impossible. She refuses to let him go. Never underestimate what you carry. Never underestimate the weight of your words. When they rise up on behalf of someone else, never underestimate the moment when you choose to walk towards someone in their darkness rather than away. Because that moment, that small, quiet, priceless moment may be the exact moment the universe decides to rewrite the ending. Elijah grew up. He finished school. He went to college. He studied medicine cardiology, specifically drawn by a pool. He could never quite explain to his professors, but never needed to explain to himself. He worked at a hospital. He sat across from families in small consultation rooms and looked at them with eyes that had seen both sides of the room, that families sit outside. And when hope seemed its most depleted, when the data seemed its most final, he would sometimes tell them a story, a true story about a boy and a machine, and a November night, and the most powerful force he had ever encountered in his life, and a little girl who refused to stop praying. Grace grew up too. She became a teacher. She taught third grade in the same neighborhood where she and Elijah had grown up, 2 doors down from each other on Maple Street, where the tree she had fallen from at 6 still stood in the backyard taller, now spreading its branches wider. She taught her students the things she had always believed, without being taught that love is not measured in size, that small people can do enormous things, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone who is suffering is to sit beside them, take their hand and refuse to accept that the darkness gets the final word. And Miriam, who had sat in that chair for 4 days with nothing left, Miriam, who had emptied herself completely of everything except love, and who had discovered that love, even empty, even desperate, even barely a whisper. Miriam lived to see her son graduate, to live to see him in his white coat, live to stand in the back of a 3rd grade classroom one afternoon and watch Grace write on the blackboard in her careful looping handwriting, the words she began every school year with. "You are not too small to matter. If you never were." Miriam read the words and pressed her hand flat against her chest, against the place where the warmth had come that night, in room 7, where the hollow had been filled, and H's, where the cracked open place had healed, into something stronger than what it had been before. Because that is what broken things become, when they are tended by love, stronger at the broken places, more beautiful for having mended. And somewhere in the world, in every hospital, in every waiting room, in every 2 a.m. corridor, where someone sits in a hard plastic chair and wonders if they can hold on for 1 more hour, this story is still happening. Some version of it, some child, some prayer, some act of unreasonable, irrational science defying love. The miracle is not rare. The miracle is waiting. It is waiting for someone who has not yet been told that it is impossible. This has been a fixed Grillo production. May you carry this story with you wherever you go, and may it remind you on your hardest days that the smallest light held with conviction, offered with love, has always been and will always be enough to push back the dark. Amen and amen.